On the Common Link Theory, CLT, by Fahad Alhomoudi. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. On the interpretations of the CLT. The proponent's approach. The CLT was accepted by many Western scholars and was spread widely through the writings of Cook and Juynboll, although each stressed different aspects. Cook applied the theory in various fields of Islamic studies other than law, particularly theology. In his book, Early Muslim Dogma, Cook quotes Peter Brown to the effect that Islam is a great traditional religion, and therefore open to two possible strategies of investigation. One strategy is to step outside the tradition and to piece together testimonies such as those found in sources independent of it, while the other strategy is to try and isolate and date the oldest elements preserved within the tradition, and more generally to seek some criteria of stratification for its vast literary remains, a strategy that to date has been exemplified by the researches of Schacht in the field of law. After describing these two strategies, Cook applies the latter, following in Schacht's footsteps. As Cook himself states, the first point to consider is the Sunnah of the Prophet. Schacht's reconstruction of the evolution of this notion sees it as a result of secondary development. Cook, however, applies this to theology, particularly the Murji variety, by suggesting the following hypothesis. At some time in the second half of the second century, certain Kufan traditionists attempted to bring about a partial rehabilitation of the Murji heritage in a form compatible which was coming to be regarded as orthodoxy. This attempt involved changes of two kinds. First, the Murji doctrine of faith was suppressed, and the tendentious notion of the origin of irja was identified, exclusively with the suspension of judgment on the First Civil War. Secondly, this heritage was disassociated from its immediate background in Kufan Murjiism, though through the fabrication of isnads. The new isnads bypassed the Kufan Murjis by invoking the names of long-dead Hijazis. Al-Irja, assuming that it already existed, would have been the grist to the mill of our traditionists. And if one is looking for a milieu in which one could have been tendentiously edited or falsely ascribed, this was certainly one. Cook also took into consideration another of Schacht's objections to the validity of isnads, i.e., the spread to their authorities. In fact, it was Cook who was the first to go further and propose that such theories could be studied more deeply, stating, "The raising of isnads is not, however, the only mode of forgery with which we have to reckon. Another process, and one considerably more disruptive of information, was likewise identified and named by Schacht. Parallel with the improvement and backward growth of isnads goes the spread. That is the creation of additional authorities or transmitters for the same doctrine or tradition. The idea of spread of isnads is one of such basic implications for their study that it is worth setting out more fully than is done by Schacht." To the historical and political reasons offered by Goldziher and Schacht for the forgery of isnads and the appearance of the common link theory, Cook added another ingenious explanation. Let us suppose, and I wish to put into circulation, a certain point of view. In the modern academic culture, that its high valuation of originality, I would like to think, and have it thought, that the idea was my own. Any flaw in my scholarly morality will thus be manifested in a failure to acknowledge that I had the idea from another scholar. In a traditionist culture, by contrast, the relevant value is not originality but authority. Sharp practice consists in falsely ascribing my view to a greater authority than myself. Despite applying this theory to the study of theology, Cook did not validate it entirely in his latest book, Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong in Islamic Law, and was cautious about using it, even though he regarded it highly. Cook in fact states in his earlier work, Schacht's discovery of the spread of isnads is in fact a highly ambivalent contribution to knowledge. It can be seen as the foundation of a new method of isnad criticism, and it can be seen as a neat demonstration that such a method cannot be devised. One ignores Schacht at one's peril, but one also follows him at one's peril. It is noteworthy that Schacht himself acknowledged the possibility of applying this theory to fields other than legal hadith. Rubin mentions this when discussing the evidence of the isnad, saying, although Schacht spoke mainly of legal hadith, he was convinced that his finding held good for traditions related to history as well. It was not only Cook who encouraged further applications of the common link theory in other fields. Before Cook, Robson had acknowledged the work begun by Goldziher and developed by Schacht in his Origins, where the problem of the development of legal traditions is discussed with great acumen. Robson valued the evidence provided by Schacht that demonstrated how and when legal traditions were produced. More importantly, he believed that Schacht's theory made a fundamental contribution to the problem, having developed a technique that could be applied to the study of other types of traditions. Cook's approach has been recognized even by scholars who do not fully agree with Schacht's findings. Gregor Scholar, for example, states that Schacht's aim was to show that his theory, already known in Islamic legal studies, could also be applied to historical tradition. The historical implications have been mentioned by historians like Bernard Lewis, who suggest that Schacht's research has shown that many traditions of apparently historical content in fact serve a legal or doctrinal purpose and are therefore historically suspect. Juynboll's stance, on the other hand, reflects a different approach to the CLT. His approach consisted of elaborating on Schacht's theory and expanding its application. In his book Muslim Tradition, he argues that the CLT did not receive the attention, elaboration, or simply the emphasis that it truly seems to deserve. The development of Juynboll's attitude towards prophetic tradition, and particularly the spread of isnads and the influential role of the CLT on the formation of Islamic law, can be traced to the beginnings of his career as a scholar. In his early writings, Juynboll pointed out the differences in conclusions reached by Western scholars from those arrived at by Muslim scholars, especially in Egypt. The main reason for these differences, in Juynboll's opinion, was that modern Egyptian scholars no longer recognized the achievements of the Orientalists. His opinion was broadly stated and made no reference to the CLT or any of Schacht's other theories. Nor, however, did he concede that Western scholars in general do not recognize the achievement of Eastern scholars, whether from the ancient schools or from the contemporary period. Juynboll notes that the structure of Schacht's Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence is so difficult and so complexly cross-referenced that it obviously discouraged reviewers from writing more than very superficial critiques. He made his own first attempt to challenge Schacht's theory in a 1969 article, concentrating mainly on the issue of the Great Fitna. Here it is not my aim to criticize nor evaluate Juynboll's theory regarding the meaning of the Fitna, but to introduce this argument because it's strongly related to the CLT, and because Juynboll uses it to take the origin of the Isnad. Whilst most sources assume the Fitna means the murder of Uthman, Schacht suggests that the Fitna began with the killing of the Umayyad Caliph Walid ibn Yazid in 126 after the Hijrah. Juynboll, for his part, disagreed with Schacht and sought to prove that the fitna in the report attributed to Ibn Sirin might have meant the political upheaval following Abdullah ibn Zubair's seizure of Hijaz. Juynboll states, "On this hypothesis, if accepted, I intended to build a convincing case for another hypothesis concerning a tentative chronology of the institution of the Isnad, as having originated at the earliest in the 70s of the 7th century, rather than immediately following the murder of Uthman in 35 or 656, as generally assumed in the sources from the Abbasid period onward." Juynboll's book, Muslim Tradition, looks at the growth of prophetic tradition and pays particular attention to 5 subjects related to the topic: the chronology of the origin of the traditions, the role of qadis in the spread of traditions, the states of the mutawatir traditions, Muslim hadith criticism, Rijal works as depositories of transmitters' names, and the tradition and its relationship to the credibility of the transmitters. Within this last topic, he conducts an in-depth study of the common link theory. By not taking Schacht's theory on the origins of Islamic law as his starting point in an attempt to improve upon its findings, Juynboll sought to write his own account, covering more or less the same grounds and using his own source material. Nevertheless, of the 4 main arguments related to the prophetic tradition offered by Schacht, Juynboll benefited from two in particular: Isnads have a tendency to grow backwards, and the CLT. Therefore, Juynboll illustrates the common link theory with the examples underlying its workability. Juynboll's view regarding the spread of isnads differ from that of Schacht, while Schacht attributes his spread, tadlis, directly to the common link as a way of concealing the fabricator of the tradition. Juynboll presumes that in addition to the spread of the isnads, there is the tadlis, which was introduced to solve the problem of weak hadiths, namely unauthentic hadiths that are caused by either a fabricated transmitter or through tadlis. Furthermore, Juynboll cites definitions and type of tadlis that describes it as ignominy, and that it is on the same level as fraud and deceit, trickery, falsehood, and mendacity. Towards the end of the Muslim tradition, Juynboll elucidates the CLT and provides two pieces of evidence to prove it. However, further investigation into the origins of the use of the isnad will be discussed in Chapter 3 and will further provide a workable construction to the theory. In view of the foregoing discussion, we shall take up three issues. First, Schacht's and Cook's respective influence on Juynboll's findings regarding the CLT. Second, the new terminologies introduced by Juynboll, where he sought to expand and validate the theory. And third, how Juynboll dealt with several existing isnads that contradicted his findings. To begin with the first issue, it must be acknowledged that Schacht had the most extensive influence on Juynboll's findings, not only with regard to the CLT, but also his other theories related to it. Schacht's e silentio argument, for example, was enthusiastically implemented in Juynboll's analytical approach to Hadith studies. Juynboll points to a strand of Hadith that he claims was the handiwork of Ibn Hanbal, who was from 164 to 241, which is 780 to 855. Although the evidence adduced to support his claim is that the tradition is nowhere to be found in Abdur Razzaq's Musannaf, which was written prior to Ibn Hanbal's Musnad. According to Juynboll, this evidence constitutes a clear indication that Ibn Hanbal, by producing this strand, sought to prop up this particular matan with one strand of his own, strengthening the three other partial common links that he may have received through Gundar, Ibn Nu'aym, and Abu Muawiyah. Those were names already mentioned in Abdur Razzaq's and Musannaf. The e silentio argument was generalized by Juynboll and applied to numerous other instances of Ibn Hanbal's narrations. However, this generalization would only be valid if it was based on the premise that Abdur Razzaq had narrated all the hadiths mentioned in the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal in order to validate his claim. Juynboll sought to prove it, however he did not and cannot, because Ibn Hanbal's Musnad, after all, contains 30,000 hadiths, while the Musannaf of Abdur Razzaq only contains about 20,000, clearly indicating that not all the hadiths in the Musnad are to be found in the Musannaf. Ibn Hanbal narrated 10,000 hadiths that were not narrated by Abdur Razzaq. Consequently, Juynboll's assumptions that any hadith narrated by Ibn Hanbal ought to be found in Abdur Razzaq's Musannaf is unwarranted, this carrying the strong implication that his conclusions are rendered suspect, including his highly questionable conclusion that Ibn Hanbal invented other strands for existing hadith. Stay tuned.